Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. There's almost nothing more haunting to me than a plane crash. Such a feeling of vulnerability when you get on a jet plane. There's nowhere to go and no way out if something goes wrong. And it's a feeling I've always had since my early days of travel, but it was magnified greatly back on May 25th of 1979. That was American Airlines Flight 191 and the crash over Chicago. This was a plane like on any other day, taking off from Chicago on a flight to Los Angeles, and suddenly and quickly, without gaining much altitude, the plane went down. I remember looking at the pictures and the initial reports of the crash, and the plane was completely upside down, just moments away from impact with the ground. It was so terrible to watch, and imagining the terror of those on board and inside the plane was almost unbearable. But what happened then became worse when we found out a family friend was on board this plane when it went down, and as a very young man, it was so hard for me to process that our family friend, Rodney Simmons, was on the plane coming back from a business trip. He was married to my dad's secretary, Sandra, and worked with my father in the paper industry. We'd known this family for many, many years and were quite friendly with them. When I think back on Rodney, I can still see his smile. He was a man's man. He was a hunter, strong, rugged, hefty guy with a big beard. He had a gregarious smile and a contagious laugh that I will never, ever forget. I still see the light in his eyes when I think about whenever was the last time that I saw him. And imagining Rodney on that plane was almost unbearable. But facing his tearful wife, Sandra, at the funeral was absolutely crushing, and I can't imagine what she was going through. It's very hard to find closure after a situation like that. In this instance, the cause of the crash was known. There was a loss of control of the plane caused by engine that came off due to improper maintenance. Now, it's a horrible thing that happened, but at least they figured out why. There was some closure, at least for the public, looking for the causes and the reasons of this crash. But what about TWA Flight 800? You might recall that one exploded off the coast of New York just days before the 1996 Atlanta Olympics was about to kick off, and it was originally portrayed as an explosion, a bomb, a spark, and an empty fuel tank. The story was changing over and over again. In all of these years later, the 25th anniversary, this has become one of the greatest deep state cover-ups in modern history. We'll take a look today at the facts of TWA 800, why it was covered up, and what we still need to find out with journalist and investigative author Jack Cashill when the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment.
Support this podcast online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration, nationalism, and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Community-supported investigative journalism. Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome Jack Cashill, independent writer, documentary producer, a media consultant, and author of TWA 800, The Crash, The Cover-Up, and The Conspiracy. And today we're looking at the 25-year anniversary of a deep state deception. Jack Cashill, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Hey, Rob, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Story needs to be told.
It absolutely does. And I remember watching this on TV, watching it play out as it happened from my Southern California living room back on July 17th, 1996. So take us back to that time and your awareness of this incident when it happened.
Yeah, at the time, I was no more aware than anyone else, except that I grew up in the New York area, so I paid more attention. It took place on July 17th. This is 2 days before the start of the Atlanta Olympics, which I think is a critical factor. The plane, a 747 TWA, workhorse of the aviation industry, however many years, went up like 25 years without any kind of something like a mid-air explosion, never happened before. And it takes off from JFK 819 heading to Paris, flying east along the coast of Long Island, which is a beach community. It's a beautiful night. So, literally thousands of people are out on the beaches, hanging out, just looking out, sitting on their decks or docks or whatever. And then 12 minutes out of JFK, 10 miles off the coast of Long Island, the 747 just blows up, killing all 230 people on board, 53 of whom were TWA employees, many of them dead heading back to Paris. Immediately, people knew this was not an ordinary aircraft explosion.
As we look at this, you mentioned a couple of things. The proximity to the Atlanta Olympics, which had its own high-profile event. Why did that flag you, or why is that significant that those two things were in the proximity of each other?
Well, I think it would have justified what was going on at that time. And that is, there was, in the immediate vicinity of Long Island, just south of Long Island, an exercise, it's called cooperative engagement, capability exercise that involved several cruisers, submarines, and the giveaway was the Navy P-3 Orion, which was the airplane. It was actually a sub-hunter, but it was used to coordinate these exercises. So the various entities in the group would send their signals to the P-3, and the P-3 would distribute the information back among them. Well, the giveaway is that the P-3 was hovering 1 mile above the head of this 747 when it exploded. They can't explain that away.
Jack, let's talk about the initial investigation, and this is very interesting. Normally, who handles these investigations, and where did it go?
Well, by law, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, was chartered to do exactly that. They have exclusive authority over domestic plane crashes. And this was that. It was a domestic plane crash. However, within hours of the crash, the FBI had already maneuvered the NTSB out of the way. And this was being orchestrated, not by the FBI itself, but out of Washington, presumably out of the White House. Certainly the field executor was a woman named Valerie Caproni, the Southern District of New York, the chief prosecutor of Southern District of New York. She brought in the FBI. The NTSB was relegated to second-class status. They were denied access to the material they should have had access to right away. Now, the FBI can be brought into a case only after a crime has been declared. In this case, a crime was never declared. So it was presumptuous from the very beginning. But that was public. What was not public, and I did not discover until we FOIA'd these CIA documents many years later, that the CIA was engaged, as they said, from day one. And in reality, the CIA was calling the shots for the FBI. And the FBI was kind of stuck in the middle. Although they employed enormous amounts of manpower, they were nonetheless relegated to their own second-class status. And then there's one other entity that deserves attention, and that is the fourth estate, in this case, the New York Times. And that the crash took place in its backyard. The New York Times owned the story. As it turned out, the FBI would only talk to the New York Times. So all the other media were dependent on what the Times said. And the New York Times was, both corrupted by its familiarity, its connection to the FBI. I mean, that was something of which they were jealous. And secondly, by the politics of the situation. This was a few months before the re-election campaign of Bill Clinton in 1996, and a lot was at stake. So it was not, the investigation proceeded by no known book.
Jack, you became interested at an event on February 23rd, 2000. Your interest was ratcheted up by hearing an investigative reporter by the name of James Sanders. Tell us about that evening.
Yeah, I belong to this political club, and they have monthly speakers, and I got there late, in fact. I got there during the Q&A, and what surprised me was the amount of people in attendance and how passionate they were about this issue. And then, of course, it dawned on me that TWA was the Kansas City, where I live, was the ancestral home of TWA 800. So they had been headquartered here for many years, and many pilots, mechanics, in fact, the overhaul base is still open, flight attendants, etc., had continued to live in Kansas City, and they were there in force. And to a person, they agreed that the plane had been shot down and they'd been lied to. That piqued my interest. And then later on, I got to talking to James Sanders' wife. We went out to dinner afterwards, a bunch of people. And she's the sweetest, nicest person you could meet. And she had been a flight attendant and then a trainer for TWA. She went to one of the many memorial services. There were 53 of her colleagues who died. And she ran into a pilot friend who was the head 747 pilot and manager at the investigation site on Long Island. She was telling me her story, and this pilot, his name Terry Stacy, came up to her and said, "Is your husband still an investigative reporter?" And she said, "Yeah." Stacy said, "Well, he needs to talk to me." So shortly after that, Sanders and Stacy started meeting, and Stacy started funneling information to Sanders about that had been suppressed by the FBI or they had been denied access to the results. Mm-hmm. TWA was a partner in this investigation, as was Boeing, as was the NTSB, but the FBI was calling the shots, at least on the ground. Behind the scenes, the CIA was calling the shots. And they started meeting, they started talking, and then Sanders, at one point, and here's where the federal government used its wiles to get at all of them, Sanders asked Stacy to scrape off the back of one of these, the seat backs, and one of the rows of the 747 that had been sort of sprayed by this red residue, inexplicable red residue. The FBI had it tested, but they wouldn't give the results to the NTSB or to TWA. Stacy went in to scrape some of the residue off. It wouldn't scrape, and so what he did is he took a pinch of foam rubber with the residue on it, FedExed it to Sanders, and for that act, the three of them were arrested, and Sanders and his wife Elizabeth were convicted in a Long Island federal court of aiding and abetting the theft of airplane parts and conspiracy. That's when I met Elizabeth Sanders and heard her story. That's when I got the sense that there's a deeper story here than meets the eye.
It's totally outrageous what happened to them. Did they serve time, and if so, how long?
The FBI realized that if they put them in prison, especially Elizabeth, she was really so sweet and pretty. And yeah. She's a Filipina, and she's your sister, she's your mother, she's your daughter. They would have created martyrs out of them. So what they did is they gave James a 5-year probation and 3 years for Elizabeth, and they were confined to house arrest, that sort of thing. So basically, they tried to neutralize his career, and they labeled him on his arrest. The FBI sent out a press release saying, "Conspiracy theorist and his wife arrested." What was curious about this, Rob, and unfortunate, is that when they were tried, the jury was not allowed to hear that James Sanders, who had already written 2 books, was an investigative reporter. And so they, evaluated the evidence as though we were just a common thief.
What became of the sample that was taken? Was it ever tested and determined what that substance was?
Yes, that's where it gets interesting. Yeah. What Sanders did is he took half of his sample and gave it to CBS, to a woman at CBS named Christina Borgeson, who's one of the heroes of the story. And then he took another half out to his West Coast lab and had it tested where it had tested consistent with fuel from a thermite missile. Then when he released that information in a newspaper article, in a California newspaper, that's when all hell broke loose. That's when the FBI came hounding after him and Elizabeth, because they were public, but their source inside the investigation was still private. They had to get at that source. And the Sanders wouldn't talk. So Elizabeth had to go into hiding for 8 months at a Oregon trailer park, nearly lost her mind. And James just clammed up. Meanwhile, they used other, without all the methods at their disposal to hunt down Terry Stacy. In fact, they were much more serious about that investigation than they were about how the plane got shot down.
You spoke, at least in the editorial that you had published, Jack, favorably of James Kallstrom, just in his integrity, at least what you thought he had, and yet he has passed away just previous to this anniversary, this 25-year anniversary. What do you think happened there, based on, I know you had a couple of conversations with him, what do you think went on?
Well, that's an excellent question, because for you, here's what we know about Kallstrom. He was a Marine that fought in Vietnam heroically, did great work with the FBI, hunting down mobsters. Then he got involved in 800. That was his big case. But then after that, he seemed contrite. And he would, in the waning days of the 2016 election, he was showing up routinely on Fox News as their terrorism expert, openly denouncing the Clintons and openly championing Donald Trump, which was almost unheard of for anyone in government. He was retired by that time. So I thought there was a possibility that he could be gotten to. So I sent him a registered letter with a few weeks left in the campaign. And I said, hey, if you really want to make a difference in this campaign, let's go public about TWA. Don't just tell the truth. Because there's no doubt that the Clintons orchestrated the cover-up. So what happens is I vote absentee. I go to France to sit out the election. I live in a liberal neighborhood. I don't want to hear their guff, especially if they win. I'm sitting out, this is kind of a bizarre story, but I'm sitting out on the Riviera in Nice, overlooking the Mediterranean on a bench. It's about 6 o'clock. There's a bunch of French people sitting nearby. And I get a call on my cell phone, and it says Connecticut. So I pick it up, and it says, Jack Cashill? I said, yeah. And then, I'd heard that Kallstrom was a profane bully. Well, he more than lived up to his reputation on both counts. I don't know if the French can understand many of the words that he was saying, but the one word, he carpet F-bombed me. He was just one after another. And then as I'm talking to him, though, I'm thinking this guy, I thought that he was less bright than I thought he was. He seemed not to know. And so at one point he said, are you telling me the terrorists shot down that airplane? As though he'd never heard that before. And I said, no, I wish I were telling you that. I said, the evidence is overwhelming that our Navy shot down that airplane by mistake. That's when he really flew off. F this, F that, F it, F it. And then he goes on like this, and this is where it gets kind of amusing. He says, you remind me of that effing Pierre Salinger who held the effing press conference on the effing French Riviera. And I'm thinking, thank God I didn't tell him where I was. I mean, we'd be at war with France now. So, and then the next day, bizarrely, he butt dials me. That was an awkward conversation.
So I want to go through the various scenarios, because this was so strange. And I remember watching it as a young man and saying, what's going on here? It started off with the talk of a bomb, then a spark in a fuel tank, and that there was some story about bomb detection, dogs being trained on it. Take us through the trajectory of stories here, because it's almost just foolish to listen to the progression that they went through to try to hide all this.
That's right, and the New York Times is critical to this whole thing because they're the organ for the FBI. The first 24 hours, there's a degree of truth in the air. People are saying what they saw. This is just before the internet hits. It's at the time only about 10% of the people had the internet, so it was hard for people to communicate among themselves. But MSNBC bought which had been on the air for only 2 days and had yet to take on its ideological cast, had bought in an auction an actual video of a missile going up hitting the airplane. And they showed it that night several times before, and I have this firsthand from the source at MSNBC, although he would not go public with this, nonetheless, he was telling the truth. They were there, and then some men in suits came and confiscated all the copies and threatened them with all kinds of horrible things that they should ever talk about it. And yet thousands of people saw those videos. I've heard from literally hundreds of them. So that was that. That was out. So the Tucker missile was in the air. One of the pilots, a helicopter pilot who had a Vietnam experience, stared the explosion right in his face, and he said he saw missiles. They just shut him down immediately. So after the day of missile talk, the FBI changed the scenario to a bomb, which was never very credible to begin with. But with the Atlanta Olympics starting 2 days, you can't have talk of rogue missiles going off in the airspace around New York. Especially, people presume they were terrorist missiles. The bomb scenario is much safer, much more calming. And the New York Times started dropping articles about the bomb. By mid-August, that was the fully established scenario. On August 23rd, the New York Times had a headline, an above-the-fold headline, and says, prime evidence found that explosive device in TWA cabin destroys the 747. And there it was, bomb destroys the 747 in the cabin. That's the story. It's the headline of the New York Times. And they use a lot of supporting data. PETN, RDX found on a wing, blah, blah, blah. And yet, a month later, they had to walk all of that back because, for whatever reason, the administration decided they could get away with a mechanical failure. The mechanical failure story came not from the FBI, but from the NTSB. And it was being pushed by the NTSB chair, a guy named Jim Hall, who was an Al Gore crony who knew nothing about aviation. Or even, as the Washington Post said, the most he knows about is aviation. Mostly about transportation is he has a driver's license. He was a buffoon, but he did their bidding. And so he went out and said it was mechanical. We believe there's no evidence now of an explosion. What they had to do then is to walk away all the stories they told about the explosive residue found all over the airplane and test it. And this is where Kallstrom comes in, and where his most deplorable moment as an FBI agent. He was the one who gets out there and says, well, we've done some investigation. What we've discovered is that there had been a bomb training exercise, a dog training exercise, on that plane, that very same plane a month earlier in St. Louis. The dog and the training officer, St. Louis police officer actually, was careless, and his material was leaking, got all over the plane, and thus accounts for the residue. Well, I'm writing a book with James Sanders 6 years after the fact, and I'm the first one in the media to talk to the officer, right? That's how bad this is. The New York Times ran this story without ever talking to the police officer. The FBI broke the news of this without ever talking to the police officer. As was easily proved, the exercise took place not on the 747 plane, but on a clone plane who was sitting next door. I mean, the time scheduling. The plane was on the way to Hawaii when the test was alleged to have taken place. And nothing was leaked. Where the placements of the explosive materials were did not match where they were on the plane, like the right wing. Who's going to do a dog exercise on the right wing? Right. And not only that, but there was nothing leaking. It was a total cock-up of a story. And I talked to the cop, who was an African-American guy, who was really steaming still years later because they made him out to look like a dupe, like a dope, with his stupid dog Carlo, screwed the whole thing up, and led the FBI on this false chasing of a bomb theory. That's how easy it was to get away with.
Spark in the empty fuel tank story, though, it seems to me in my memory, my recollection of this, Jack Cashill, is that sparked a whole another investigation. In other words, is this a problem that could happen on other planes? Am I remembering correctly? Wasn't this blown far beyond this particular incident to look at other planes and see if this could happen to them?
Yeah, right. You see, the NTSB took 4 years on its investigation because what they had to do was try to find a plausible explanation for why a 747 First of all, let's say no aircraft, commercial aircraft in the age of Jet A fuel had ever self-combusted in midair. It never happened. Hasn't happened since. They had to find as plausible explanation as they could for why this could have happened. So that took them 4 years, and it was a joke. The whole thing was, and they would stage these tests with Jet A fuel, which is what they use. It's like kerosene. I mean, you could drop a lit match into a tank of that fuel, and it wouldn't ignite. It would douse the match. It's not highly explosive. It only becomes explosive when it's vaporized, like when it gets hit by a missile. So the fuel tank did eventually blow up. It simply wasn't the initiating event. There had been, at least 2 or 3 missile strikes before the fuel tank blew up. So they had to try to find a way they could stage a demonstration to make this happen. And when they used Jet A fuel, it didn't work. So yes, we have total evidence of is that they would, they like sneak nitroglycerin into these demonstrations, and so they could have video of a plane blowing up on its own. It was terrible and unfortunate, and expensive, and deceptive. No planes were taken off the runways, including Air Force One, which is a 747. Some years later, they came up with this, nostrum about having to, inject nitrogen or something. It was all done as show. Just like the whole reconstruction of the plane was done as show. It's amazing they got away with it. This is the most provably false exercise in deception by the American establishment in peacetime in our history.
I want to talk also, speaking of deception, I had a chance to watch the CIA animation, which is almost laughable that the top of the plane blew off and then it kept going up. It would seem to me the whole thing would fall apart if the top of the plane comes off. It certainly wouldn't go up thousands of feet without the head of the plane on.
No, you're right. And what they had to do was the CIA was reckless. They were making up interviews with the eyewitnesses. It just so happens that this past Saturday, July 17th, I was driving through Pennsylvania, and I stopped and I had lunch with a man named Mike Wire, who was the key eyewitness. He was the eyewitness around whom the CIA based its animation, the man on the bridge. And it was funny because his wife was there. I've gotten to know them well over the years. It's just an odd digression, but the waitress comes up. She goes, "Oh, I only thought you came on your anniversaries," because he comes to this restaurant. It was the Washington Crossing Inn, by the way, right on the Delaware. And I said to her, "Well, bizarrely, this is an anniversary." I said, "This is the 25th anniversary of TWA Flight 800." And I'd explain a little what was going on. They took his initial statement, and then, his initial statement said, "Yeah, I was standing on this bridge. He heard this huge explosion, and after the fact, but he saw an object come zigzagging up from behind the beach houses. He's in West Hampton. Arc, red tip, smoky contrail. 200 people said the same thing. And then it arcs over at the last minute. He sees a bright white explosion, then a big yellow fireball, etc." That's what he told them. In the CIA report, they said that the witness on the bridge was so key, and this is what they say in the animation too. He saw an object that was about 20 degrees above the horizon, just where TWA 800 would have been. And then when the nose blew off, he saw it ascend, from an extra, 3,000 feet, like I said, 3,500 feet. When this broke, no one knew the names of these witnesses. They only had numbers. Curiously, unfortunately, or fortunately rather, the FBI, his name is Wire, W-I-R-E, and the FBI failed to redact his name in one instance, thinking it was a common word. And some very sharp investigators from Accuracy and Media finally ran down Mike, and they said, in your initial interview, it says you saw the plane coming off the beach. Why did you change it in the second interview? And he says, "What second interview? There was none." And I found several other eyewitnesses. All the key eyewitnesses, they manufactured second interviews for them. To try to debunk them. The best eyewitness was a witness named number 73. She called me one day out of the blue in 2009. They were talking 13 years after the fact. And she was willing to call me only because her husband was dying, and he wanted her to stay out of it. And he was on his deathbed. And she was in a hospital not too far from where I was. She said, "I'm witness 73. You know who I am?" I said, "Absolutely." I said, "Upside down Nike swoosh." She goes, "Yeah." And she, in No one had a better view than she did. She was an aviation professional. She was tracking the 747 as it moved across. She said to her friends, well, that plane's awfully low for this time, this trajectory on its flight. And it had been kept low so another plane could pass overhead. And then she sees the missile come up off the horizon. She tracks it, the red flare, smoky contrail, the arc, which she called an upside-down Nike swoosh, And the FBI reported it clearly. And so then when she called, I said, yeah, but why did you change your testimony in the second interview? The second interview has her saying, well, that night I was drinking Long Island iced teas, and I'm not exactly sure what I saw, and I'm really fuzzy about it given my state at the time, blah, blah, blah. And I said, she goes, well, first of all, I don't know what a Long Island iced tea is, she says. I said, could it have been another drink? She said, I don't drink at all.
Wow.
I said, and finally she said, there was no second interview. They made this up. She had just found out about this, and that's why she called me. Because I think the CIA had released all these documents, and there she sees her second interview, and she knew she didn't have one. That's the way they operate, and that's the way they got away with it.
Jack Cashill, finally, is there any hope in your mind that the truth will ever be admitted to by the government? In other words, what would it take for this to be out in the open, what really happened?
Well, after my article appeared last week in the American Thinker, I got a lot of response, as I expected. And I also did a couple hours on Coast to Coast. And I said, at this point, here's what I need. I mean, I appreciate all your calls and all your information. And I got, lots of side information. I don't need secondhand accounts. I don't need talks from mechanics or, et cetera. I need the guy who pulled the trigger. I have one guy who came forward, and I talk about him in my book, TWA 800, who was on one of the cruisers in that exercise. And he was very forthright about what he knew. But he did not see the missile go up, and he just knew about having to destroy all their evidence and to take off for Bermuda and shut down all information, outside contact, etc. But he was in that naval group right off the coast of Long Island. And no, I need the guy who pulled the trigger. I need a guy who either pulled the trigger or knew the guy who saw the guy pull the trigger, or who was that close. Or I need someone in government. There are people in government who know. Sandy Berger was one, but he's gone. I think he went into the archives to get that information. The Clintons know. They're never going to talk, obviously. Leon Panetta, I think, knows. He could talk. Jamie Gorelick would be a very interesting person to come forward. She won't. The White House people won't. They're loyalists. And they have nothing to gain. And the problem now is that even if a high-level person came forward to the New York Times and told them the story, the New York Times would not want to hear it. I've met with the publisher of the New York Times and told him this story. I had a one-on-one breakfast. He didn't want to hear it. I've met with the New York Times reporter who reported on the story, told him shared all my evidence. He didn't want to hear it. I met with Michael Isikoff when he was in Newsweek. He didn't want to hear it. I mean, it wasn't like I was trying to create a conspiracy theory. I was walking all my evidence around, presenting it to these people and saying, hey, it's all here. Don't believe me. Just look at the evidence. Because I'm not the only one who's been on this case. There's been people who know much more about aviation than I do, like Tom Stalkup, the physicist, and Ray Laird, the airline pilot who was in charge of airline safety. Vernon Gross, who was on the NTSB board. He set me up with a sort of like an ambush lunch with the current head of the current chairman of the NTSB board. He wouldn't, but he didn't want to see it. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want to know. I gave him a copy of my book. I said, you just read the book.
Yeah.
The book is totally convincing. You can't not be convinced if you read the book. And everyone in the aviation community, save for a few diehards and a few CIA plants, knows what happened. It was such a clumsy, improvised conspiracy on the government's part. I'm not a theorist. I'm just a reporter. In fact, the current word for conspiracy theorist, or the old word for conspiracy theorist, was journalist. Now a real reporter is a conspiracy theorist because so much cannot be told.
Jack Cashill, you've dedicated a large portion of your life to this story, and I do want people to get the information that you've shared with us. Can you tell us where we could reach you and also where we could get a copy of your book, TWA 800?
Yeah, I can be reached through my website, Cashill.com, CASHILL.com. It'll tell you how to contact me if you have that solid first-hand information I'm looking for. It'll also, posted on that page is my the C-SPAN presentation. This is a good, quick way to get it, that I did for my book at the TWA Museum in Kansas City with an audience of TWA veterans, none of whom disbelieved me. If this is a conspiracy theorist, it's believed by everyone in the know. Those are the quickest ways. My book is available on Amazon or wherever you buy books. It's called TWA 800, The Crash to Cover Up the Conspiracy. I have a new book out, Barack Obama's Promised Land, Deplorables Need Not Apply, which I would encourage your audience to look at also. Yeah, this is a story that, I thought it would break at some point. I'm an optimist. I don't give up, but now it's history. It's no longer news.
It's very sad, but I do hold out hope that all of these efforts will pay off. Jack Cashill, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Hey, Rob, excellent job. Thanks for having me.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,